Morning, gentlemen. Thank you for coming today and thank you for your submissions. What I propose to do is to take you all through the submissions that you've made, perhaps for some points of clarification, allow you to expand upon some of your points if you feel that's necessary. And then I'll have some general questions for all five of you, and then I'll open up to my colleagues to join in and ask some further questions. I would point out that even though I'm going to start, I think, with the Channel NewsAsia submission, actually both submissions have a lot in common. So actually, if you all agree with each other and you agree with each other's points, that may speed up the proceedings as we go along, and we don't necessarily need to repeat ourselves. But we'll see how things go. So if I could begin with the CNA submission by the senior editors. You have it, I hope, in front of you. But if you look at your third point, your third paragraph under the introduction, you make the point that fundamentally the conflation of these DOFs with the popular and wider use of fake news also threatens the credibility of the mainstream media, ultimately leading to a loss of trust between the mainstream media and the public. You see this as a serious problem, that the existence of these DOFs and that conflation can affect your role that you can play as the mainstream media?
Yes, we do. I think it's quite clear that the threat of DOF and its association with the term fake news has basically been hijacked by many parties to label serious journalism that they disagree with as fake news. And this basically threatens fundamentally what we do and how we tend to inform society accurately. It's an excuse by many parties to rubbish serious journalism, basically.
So would it be fair to say that if we were successful at engaging with the issue of deliberate online falsehoods, one of the effects would be then an increased level of trust in credible journalism?
Hopefully, yes.
Okay. If I could move you to the second page of your submission, where you talk about how you might define a deliberate online falsehood. And you've suggested three minimum criteria. You begin with that the content in question must be proven to be false. And I presume, and you've said some of this in the rest of your paragraph, that you're drawing distinctly a line between commentary and opinion on one hand and a provable fact on the other hand. Is that right?
Yes.
Secondly, you suggested this, of course, must reside online, that implicit in the name deliberate online falsehood. But I think your rest of your paragraph, you are making the point that the characterization of something being online is potentially very broad, referring to different types of technologies, different types of products, platforms, and services, and that any actions we take should be, in a way, platform agnostic. Would
Yes.
that be a characterization that you
Yes,
agree with?
that's accurate.
And thirdly, you've highlighted the issue that we must, of course, deal with things that are circulated deliberately, and that you want to ensure that things that are inadvertent, genuine errors are not inappropriately, harshly punished.
That is correct.
So we have to establish the intent prior to then taking any action. You've gone on to then suggest that in order for a DOF to attract, and I quote, potential regulatory corrective measures, you've suggested 5 objectives that this DOF should have had the intent to address. The first is to influence the democratic processes, compromise national security, undermine the judiciary, affect racial or religious harmony, and lastly, manipulate financial and economic outcomes. Why have you chosen these 5?
We wouldn't suggest that this is a comprehensive list of all the potential objectives, but these to us are some of the key fault lines in Singapore.
And if it was a deliberate online falsehood that did not address a key fault line or an issue of similar impact?
Then a graduated approach might be necessary.
Okay. You move on in your submission to talk about reach. Why do you believe that reach matters? In your point 1 under that paragraph, you've suggested that where an individual or organization with limited reach makes one post on one occasion, it may not necessarily need to be addressed as a DOF. So you're suggesting in your paragraph 2 that there should be thresholds to determine reach and frequency to decide what a DOF is.
Ultimately, this I think, goes to the core of the issue of what I think the previous panel was talking about in terms of freedom of speech. In that when we do look at metrics, if we do look at measures, that the measures are targeted and specific enough not to provide excuses for people who may have done things accidentally or who may be just participating in a very close chat with another person.
But I'll put it to a weakness of your position. There are two weaknesses I would see. One is that it allows some then protection for parties that you've just criticized, who are trying to undermine mainstream media, trying to undermine trust in our organizations and our processes, that they could hide behind the fact that they are much smaller than organizations such as yourselves, and therefore do not need to attract attention. The second weakness then for that position is that even if they are themselves small, a third party can then significantly amplify their deliberate online falsehood to the detriment of all of us.
So in which case, if there were measures targeted, the measures will also look at that third party.
Thank you. If I could move you then to your fifth page. Fundamentally, the key point I want to draw out here is that you believe that whatever body is established should be accountable to Parliament. That you feel that's a necessary precondition for the effective work of such a body.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. If I could move to the SPH team.
Minister, if I could just
Please.
jump in. I agree with quite a lot of what my colleagues have said. I think if you refer to the Edelman Trust Barometer findings, which we've included in our representation, trust levels of the media in Singapore has been consistently high, but it has been on a downward trend, largely because of the conflation between mainstream and social media. And I think that's where it impacts on our credibility, because people have this difficulty distinguishing between fake and real news. And online, you do see a deliberate attempt to have a constant drip feed attacking the mainstream media. And I think there's a clear commercial and political purpose behind that, because it is in their interest to cast a certain doubt about the mainstream media and therefore divert attention and audiences, and with that, revenues to their sites. So there is a clear impact on us.
I'm going to ask you to expand a little bit upon that, Mr. Fernandez. Could you explain to us who you believe the they in what you've just said are? Secondly, expand a bit on what you see is the benefit that they would get out of this. You suggested that it's about revenue, and is that the limit of it? And thirdly, could you explain a little bit about the drip feed phenomenon that you just talked about? I mean, what is being drip fed to us?
Well, it's an attempt to, I think, undermine trust, as you've mentioned. The drip feed comes in constant attacks on the mainstream media, pot shots that are taken at us, questioning our credibility, pointing to delays in information. And I think some of it comes from the different standards that we hold in terms of what we consider to be credible and reliable news. Because we wouldn't put out information which we were uncertain about. We would check and cross-check, and that sometimes takes time. It sometimes takes effort to verify. And we may choose not to put something out because we think the information is dubious, but you may see it happening online. And then aspersions or questions are raised about why we are withholding that information when there's absolutely no intention to withhold information. It's more a process of us going through that checking that's necessary. So I think when I say they, I refer to other sites. I refer to individuals, bloggers who have an interest in undermining the credibility of the mainstream media.
What do you believe is their interest in undermining your work?
Well, as I've mentioned, it's partly to draw attention and audiences to their alternative sites and away from us. So there is a commercial purpose.
The commercial purpose. Thank you. This issue of the professionalism of journalists is a matter I will return to. But if I could maybe take you through your submission from SPH. Your paragraph 2, the first part of that, essentially summarizes what you've just said, that a central tenet of combating such falsehoods is to maintain a strong, trusted, and well-resourced mainstream news media. You believe that that's necessary for us going forward in dealing with deliberate online falsehoods in any shape or form. Similarly, in your paragraph 5, you've suggested some factors to determine how we should address a deliberate online falsehood. And you've suggested that there should be a test of intent, whether the false information is created and spread with malice, with mischief, for the sake of profit, or for other self-serving reasons that display a blatant disregard of truth. And then you've tried to draw the distinction to exclude genuine errors, satire or parody, and where there has been an intent to help, but someone has been misled. Secondly, you've talked about a test of significance. So similarly to the submission from CNA, and you've drawn the factors of public interest, societal harmony, political election results, and public health issues. So largely overlapping, but there are some individual factors on both sides which are slightly different. And again, you've talked about a test of virality or reach, and I draw your attention, also other multiplier channels such as through word of mouth or other offline methods. So the approach, in a way, needs to be technology, platform, and process agnostic, and dealing with the intent, the impact, and the reach of that falsehood. In your paragraph 9, you've said, the proliferation of fake news in recent times and greater public awareness of its negative consequences has also resulted in greater confidence and reliance in media organizations known for reliable and quality content. That's a little bit at odds with what you've just told us.
No, it's not. If you look at the Edelman findings again, they have found that with the proliferation of fake news, the trust in professional journalists has gone up by 5 percentage points, whereas the trust in social media sites has gone down. And what that says to me is that there is a sense amongst the public that they are looking for people they can rely on, people they trust, people who are credible, to help them make sense of what's going on out there. And I think that's where the challenge comes to us to maintain that trust with the public. And that's why it's so important that that trust is not undermined by other players.
How do you know you have the trust of the public?
Well, the Edelman findings is one form, but I think ultimately the best indicator is a market test. We see people coming to us daily. Millions of readers come to our products, our papers, our websites, and these are paid products. They are paying for that content, and they wouldn't if they didn't believe us. I think some reference was made last week to the readership numbers and the circulation numbers for the Straits Times. And if you combine our print and our digital readership and circulation, they have all generally gone up. And it's often said, loosely that young people don't read the news, but that's not true because about half of our readership is from 18 to 34. So they are reading the news. And I'd also say that what's different beyond the numbers is that these days we don't just have one point of contact with the audience. When the newspaper lands on your doorstep, we are engaging with the audience on their phones, on their desktops, on their tablets, on the radio, multiple points and multiple times throughout the day. So never before has the content that we are putting out been reaching people so many times throughout the day. And I think people wouldn't be turning to us for information if they didn't trust us.
You believe that the behavior of your customers is a best marker of the trust that you have in the public. Yeah. Would Channel NewsAsia have a similar point of view?
Yes, we would, and it bears out in concrete examples that we've seen when there have been major news incidents. We've seen our traffic go up by much as 3 to 4 times, which speaks to the fact that when there is a demand for knowledge, a news event that's happening, people do turn to trusted sources such as SPH and ourselves.
And from the Channel NewsAsia point of view, would you have similar concerns about this drip feed erosion or this deliberate attempt to undermine trust in the mainstream media that?
I wouldn't say, of course, in general terms, we would have similar concerns as SPH, precisely because it's become almost fashionable for anyone who disagrees with what they read, whether simply because they don't like it, to label it fake news. And therefore, there is a certain danger in that. But as to whether or not we feel it as strongly as our colleagues on the other side of the table is of course up for debate.
Okay, I just need to remind you, gentlemen, that in order for your agreement or assent to statements made by other members of the panelists to be recorded, I would need you to actually say yes, that our transcriptors unfortunately cannot record the nod of a head.
Noted.
Thank you. Okay, if I could return to SPH paragraph 11. SPH believes in the need to actively build up the population's resistance to falsehoods via promoting media literacy.
That's right.
But are you concerned that there is a limit to how effective media literacy can be to deal with this problem?
I would say it's one of those necessary but not sufficient conditions. And I should say that when we refer to media literacy, which is a term that's been bandied about quite a lot this past week, we are referring to it in the broader sense of the term. So it's not just one or two programs that you do in school and check a box. It has to do with giving citizens access to information. So in our submissions, we've made reference to a proposed smart citizen initiative where citizens would have access to information such as our archives, which they can refer to cross-check and verify and get a sense of whether this is true or untrue. We also propose things like a partnership with other partners who can help raise awareness about the kinds of online falsehoods that have been discussed over the past week. And also, there was reference this morning to debates. Last week, for example, we partnered with the Singapore Management University to organize a debate. I think those kinds of forums in our schools help to prepare people to be discerning and skeptical citizens to be able to tell the difference between real and fake news. All of that, I think, is necessary. It's part of the process. But whether it's going to be enough in itself, I don't think so. It's necessary but not sufficient.
What do you believe is the concern with regard to its insufficiency?
Because a lot of information can be spread very quickly, and people don't always have the information to make a decision on that information. So sometimes biases can set in. So you need other forms of inoculation as well. It's no different from, say, having programs to discourage people from speeding or drink driving. That doesn't mean you don't also have laws. You need both.
CNA, would you have similar views about how media literacy is necessary but not sufficient?
Yes, clearly. I think media literacy on a whole, the population does need to be sensitized to the threat of DOFs, the nature, how they spread, and there hasn't really been a sustained public education of these threats that the nation faces. But in itself, that is insufficient and will take many generations for that knowledge to basically seep in to our DNA.
Could I just jump in at this moment? I think we cannot assume that everyone is so tech-savvy, especially the older generation and the Chinese-speaking community. And I think this is a group that we have to pay more attention to them as well.
Sorry, if I may just...
Besides what Mr. Fernandez has mentioned, motivations or some others, maybe revenue, but there are also other reasons why people purvey certain sort of information for whatever it is, activist ideas or whatever. For that, we also need to be very careful because a strict ways actually is a judgment call. Now, the other part about this engagement, we do from time to time engage people. This part of media literacy to educate as far as readers, to sometimes go behind the scene to explain to them certain issues. That takes a lot of time, but we are not afraid to do it. We prepared to do it because if only to explain certain things in the context, in the right context of what the issues are. Thank you.
Mr. Goh, may I just follow up on your comment? Are you suggesting that the non-English speaking Singaporean population, it is easier for deliberate online falsehoods to spread amongst them or harder for us to count? You're suggesting that there's a particular challenge for the non-English speaking Singaporean population?
A challenge for them to understand the danger of falsehood. because many of them may be the first time engaging in social media for many of them. And they may not realize the impact, or they may just take it for granted that whatever they see is correct, is all truth. Yeah. And all this, I think, it is important to educate that.
In the language that they're comfortable in.
I'm sure, yes.
If I could direct you to your paragraph 13 of the SPH submission. Towards the end of the paragraph, you make a comment, the rapid diversion of advertising revenues away from content creators could also create the conditions for a fake news industry to thrive. Can you explain that? Why is this? Why does the advertising revenue and the flow of advertising revenue make a difference to how deliberate online falsehoods will spread?
Well, in a sense that the business model for the media has been fundamentally disrupted. So all of our products, our news sites, our print products were dependent largely on print advertising or digital advertising. But increasingly, a lot of that advertising is being mopped up by a few key players. And therefore, you have a disproportionate ability to respond to news developments, including fake news. And therefore, with the sort of commoditization of news, many players can come into into the space. And as a result, you open up the sphere for a lot more content which could be false to emerge on and confuse the public. Our ability to verify and cross-check is a heavily resource-intensive one. It requires tremendous resources and time to be able to sustain the newsroom of our size. If we cannot sustain our news operations, we cannot play the role that we've been playing all these decades and years. And as a result of it, I think societies will be more poorly served, because it does take resources on our part to verify every rumor and every false news, which diverts attention and resources from other important subjects which we could be covering. And therefore, it hampers our ability to do so. And the suggestions also that if we are not covering a certain story which is available online, that we might be doing it for untoward reasons, is in a way could also affect us commercially. So for all those reasons, I think it is important to look at the business case and the business models that underpin what good quality journalism requires.
Would CNA have similar views on this?
I don't think the growth of DOF or its prevalence is tied to revenue models for Channel News Asia in particular. I think our revenue models with SPH are quite different. And I think the actors who are involved in perpetuating DOFs are not doing it with the objective of disrupting our revenues. They have much larger objectives in mind. That may be a byproduct of revenues going to technology companies where DOFs might spread more rapidly, but I don't think it is a direct correlation with the growth and spread of DOFs.
The larger intent is the undermining of trust.
Undermining of trust, national security, any of the major agendas undermining our ethnic harmony.
So if I could perhaps paraphrase Mr. Warren Fernandez's comment then. You are suggesting that the business model in the digital online advertising space has rewarded deliberate online falsehoods, diverted advertising revenue to encourage the spread of deliberate online falsehoods, as a result of which resources from responsible mainstream media are sucked up to combat deliberate online falsehoods. So a vicious circle, a vicious spiral.
Broadly speaking, yes. And also, I think there has been reference in the past few days to a report that was put out by the MIT on how fake news tends to spread further, faster, and deeper than real news. So that makes it easier for people to create fake news because there is a tendency for that to spread, and that therefore becomes more commercially lucrative for them to do so.
So there's a line in your paragraph 13, the last sentence, which I think sort of sums it up very neatly. This is because the digital supply chain rewards the distributors of content, not the originators, which has serious implications for the sustainability of genuine news. If I could go down to your paragraph 14, you make a point about how newsmakers, not journalists, not the platforms and products, but that newsmakers and advertisers also have a part to play to deal with DOFs in a timely manner. And also the consumers, the audience, so that this is there is no single party that has responsibility in dealing with this. But maybe could you expand a little bit on what you feel are the responsibilities for newsmakers and consumers in terms of dealing with deliberate online falsehoods?
Well, on the part of newsmakers, I would say there is a need to be proactive in countering fake news, to be responsive to developments when they arise, so that we can come out and help clarify quickly to the public. Because in the absence of that, you leave a vacuum, and then the fake news can spread. It also raises questions why we are not reporting or coming up with a version to explain what's going on, so doubts proliferate. I think this applies to all newsmakers, whether you're public entities or private entities. I think there was even a reference to how the Catholic Church needed to do it. So I think it applies to all of it, and it may perhaps especially so on the part of governments. As for users, I think, and consumers of news, I think that healthy skepticism, that questioning before you believe something and before you share something and become a spreader of that news is also quite important. I don't know if my colleagues want to add to it.
Yes, the same goes with us, the same standard. We expect, in order for us to do a more thorough and complete job, we would be happy that all stakeholders will work with us to clarify certain things. For example, in the Berita Harian case, we work closely on matters pertaining to religion. We work closely with the Islamic Religious Council. That's where our guidance is. And then we have developed sort of relationship with them, so it's easier for us to navigate things like sensitive issues. And then that's how it has been on for years, and more so in these times of social media. Thank you.
If I could move on then to some of the recommendations in the SPH paper. You've got, between your para 15 and your para 17, you've accept, I think, that while we have existing laws with some scope, and you list out the Sedition Act, the Telecommunications Act, the Protection from Harassment Act, and the class license registration for internet content providers. Is it fair for me to say that in the way that you phrased it and what you go on to, that there are gaps in the existing laws that perhaps we need to consider addressing?
Yes, I think we framed it that way.
Yes. And specifically in your paragraph 19, you've suggested that we should consider measures that would require online platforms such as, and not limited to, Facebook, Google, WeChat, WhatsApp, Snapchat, YouTube, and Twitter to operate on a level playing field with mainstream media organizations, especially in terms of taking responsibility for the content they publish and promote. They should be required to act faster when falsehoods spread on their platforms and to disclose the identities of creators of deliberate falsehoods. Why do you feel it's important for them to behave in a way similar to a media organization? They would claim not to be a media organization. They would claim to be platforms. But I would assume, from the way that you phrased your paragraph 19, you are suggesting that we need to hold them up to the same level of responsibility with respect to their content as well as the identities of the content creators.
I think what we're suggesting is that there should be a more level playing field between all players, and these platforms which are putting out information and spreading it quite considerably ought to be held accountable. And if there's deliberate falsehood on their platforms, they should be required to take them down just as we are, and there should be that level playing field.
Any comment from CNA on this issue? Would you agree with that characterization?
I think it's extremely challenging for the tech companies to be regulated as media companies. I think the skill sets that they have in their organizations versus the skill sets that we have in our newsrooms is significantly different. I think expecting, for example, WhatsApp to be able to stop a WhatsApp chat message that is clearly a DOF would be challenging. So I think there is a space for legislation to make them more accountable for the outcomes of their dissemination, but whether they should be regulated in the same way as media companies, I'm not sure.
So there is some commonality between the two positions. You'll accept that some of their behavior impinges upon the space that media companies are working in, but that
Yes.
y'all are held to different standards. The media companies and the tech companies are held to different standards.
Yes.
And that gap in the standards has an impact for what we're dealing with here, the ability for deliberate online falsehoods to spread and have an impact on our society.
Yes.
But I think there's some disagreement between the two about what the extent of regulation on a tech company should be. Should it be a regulation that approaches what we do for the media companies, or should it be a regulation that has an outcome that is similar but perhaps through a different process? That's a little bit of a there's room for disagreement on that.
Yes.
Am I characterizing the conversation so far correctly?
Yes.
Can I add also? I think whatever it is, even the closed groups need to be looked into seriously, because from the small group, as we heard earlier, it can spread even further, right? If the level of playing field is not the same, then it's quite difficult to close the loop in that sense. So it's something that have to be looked into seriously as well. That's my position.
We are not proposing that the social media or the platforms are being regulated just as like the traditional media. But we are saying that if there's a new legislation on deliberate online falsehood, whatever applies to the mainstream media should also apply to the social media. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. If I could just, the last point from SPH's submission, which is in your conclusion, paragraph 27, I think we have, this sort of sums up your position. A major consequence of any spread of misinformation is a concurrent rise in mistrust. In today's fast-moving, digital-centered world, it is essential to update our legislation and regulatory practices to keep online falsehoods in check before they undermine our institutions, policies, or values. I think we've covered that ground, and I think largely all of you would agree with that sort of position. Please.
No, I just wanted to put in context our recommendation on new laws or regulations. I think there are legitimate concerns amongst our editors and in our newsrooms about any form of new legislation. And I should explain why there are those concerns. Because we feel that there are already quite a number of existing laws which gives the government powers, which, as you have used previously. So any further legislation is something that naturally causes concern in our minds because we have no sight of what shape or form that legislation might entail. And the reason why we believe that you should have a care in applying any new legislation is simply this. The news gathering process is not a neat and tidy one. Information doesn't come to us in a sort of completely nicely packaged form. It often comes to us in bits and pieces, some partial information, and it's incumbent on our journalists and our editors to go out there and check and verify and pull the strands together and interpret and make judgments. And in the process, sometimes you may get the complete picture, sometimes you may get assumptions which may not be entirely correct, and information might be put out which may not be the full picture. And we worry that if your legislation that you're proposing or you have in mind is so broad and so sweeping, it could impinge on our ability to do what we do day to day. So that's where we are concerned about. There's also the possibility of differences of interpretation or differences of opinion, which could then be labeled as deliberate falsehoods, which could have an impact on the willingness or the readiness of members of the public to share information with us. So for those reasons, we have said, please have a care in any new legislation that you propose or you're thinking about. And if you are minded to have new legislation, please focus your energies on the spectrum of fake news, which is really deliberate falsehoods that are being put out. And please focus your energies on ensuring a more level playing field between us and the distributors of content who should be held to account and should be held responsible for the information that they put out and they spread. That's really the context in which we're suggesting that there might be a need for further legislation.
Okay, if I could move on past any further issues with respect to the submissions. If not, I have some general questions. Both submissions talked about a fact-checking body. One was fact-checking council, the other was a fact-checking alliance. But if I could perhaps suggest that there may be common ground, that whatever process around fact-checking is established, that all of you would perhaps agree with some of the statements, that it needs to establish the truth in a way that has some strength or some trust behind it, and that for some of the matters around national security, race, religion, economic and financial issues, public health issues, by definition, that source of truth must be government-backed or state-backed. The most egregious issues, the issues with significant impact on our social fabric, on our national security, on our public health, issues of peace, stability, the facts behind those, if you're going to have a source of truth, it needs to be state-backed. Even if you set up an independent body, where are they going to get their information from? Would it not ultimately need to come from the government?
Broadly speaking, I'd agree with you, but there may be instances where information could be useful from other sources. On public health, for example, you may get professors, doctors, practitioners who have information which is also useful, and it may be better to have a non-government and independent body verifying that information rather than it coming from the government.
I'm not suggesting it needs to exclusively be from the government. I'm suggesting the government needs to be part of the process.
I wouldn't disagree.
We have no disagreement with that.
And if you were going to go down this route of having a fact-checking process, whether it's a council, alliance, or a body, the outcome and the output needs to deal with the speed of spread of the deliberate online falsehoods. That any process that is not able to deal with things that spread in minutes to hours is not going to be effective in this space.
Yes, agree.
So that, yes, yeah.
Yes, agreed that it has to move quickly, and I think we make that point, that this fact-checking body has to be able to move as quickly as the DOFs are spreading.
And if that fact-checking body is not able to move as fast as that the egregious DOFs are spreading, then in a way this approach is useful only for either DOFs that are not spreading quite so fast or do not have that large-scale national security public interest impact. There is a scale of DOFs, and both submissions have talked about this. At the one end, things which have significant scale, impact, and reach, and then right at the other end, you have satire and parody, and somewhere in between, you have issues that may or may not turn out to be significant later on. And the fact-checking process may be more appropriate for that middle ground, because I presume you wouldn't want to get involved in the stuff that is really satire and parody, and perhaps there isn't the speed or the ability to deal with things that are moving extremely fast.
I agree, but that doesn't preclude having a fact-checking body for other ends of that continuum.
Indeed. So I'm not suggesting it's exclusively one or the other.
Or it could be the case that at a time of emergency, it may be better to take down the post or news first because of national interest. But then there can be a process for whatever platform or the newspaper to go back to that independent body to say that, in fact, whatever we have reported is not fake news.
So the process need not be the same. Just as you have different bodies, you might have a different process depending on the reach, the intent, the impact, and the significance. Yeah.
Sorry, if I could just add, it also could be not so black and white. It could be flagged or referred to in different ways. So if we've referred you to the cross-check example in France, where media organizations come together and any individual or organization can surface examples of fake news, and organizations would then agree to verify and check and flag instances of fake news as being definitely false or or questionable or dubious, and you could have different reactions to that fake news. And I think there is value in that sort of a process, except in the extremist cases that you've talked about, where you may need to go to the government for an answer. But for the other ends of the spectrum, a more variegated process is probably also useful.
Anything to add?
I think we are not 100% convinced that at the end of the spectrum, where there are issues of national security, that the Fact-Checking Council could not move as quickly as needed to. That we have not seen the way this might be set up, the way it might operate. I'm not ready to rule that out completely, to say that in certain instances you wouldn't go through a Fact-Checking Council or body of that sort.
But you agree that speed is going to be necessary?
Speed is critical in this body's operations. I just haven't seen a setup that's been proposed that would mean that they couldn't move quickly.
I understand. But just to be clear, when we talk about speed, we mean, are you talking about speed of detection, speed of engagement, or speed of action?
Speed of authorizing action.
Okay. So that whatever proposal, in order to deal with egregious and significant deliberate online falsehoods, will need to be able to authorize a relevant action with some degree of speed in order to spread the falsehood from spread.
Yes.
And I think all of you all have suggested and agree, I'm sure, that even if we have a variety of processes with a variety of thresholds or a variety of bodies, the entire process needs to be accountable to Parliament. That even if you act first and then have some opportunity for recourse and appeal later, the entire process needs to be accountable for Parliament. I think that's come out in a variety of statements. Okay. So can I just ask, just for my understanding and perhaps edification of the public, all of you all have spent some time drawing the distinction between different types of deliberate online falsehoods. You're urging the government or the select committee and whoever is dealing with this to think about falsehoods in different ways depending on intent, upon reach, upon significance. Now, is there a parallel in how journalists then deal with falsehood? So you talk about the resources that you put into fact-checking, the time that's taken to process, the difficulty with verifying information. So is this something that has a corollary or has a parallel within your professional community, that you deal with the possibility of falsehood differently if that falsehood has an impact on national security versus something which perhaps has less reach, less impact, less significance, and perhaps is put out with a different intent? So do you as a community of professional journalists deal with falsehood in that differentiated way? And that's why you are asking all the rest of us to do it? Or is there some other factor at play here? I'm not sure who wants to.
We deal with falsehoods in a singular fashion. There is a zero tolerance for falsehoods, regardless of whether it has a low impact or a high impact. There are multiple checks within the newsroom to prevent falsehoods from going out. First and foremost, our reach is significant. So on the reach factor, we would basically run afoul of any sort of metric that would be put out there. Second is the issue of trust and credibility of the brand. And if we do want to differentiate ourselves from the other social media players, the other purported news organizations, one-man operations and stuff like that, we have to take a single position on that. So within the newsrooms, we have a very simple philosophy. It's described as ACT, accurate, contextual, and timely, and in that order. So the first hurdle that needs to be cleared before something is published is accuracy.
If I may, I would agree with Walter broadly. All information that we put out, we would want to be as accurate as we possibly can. So we're not cavalier about what we put out. So it would go through the same series of checks and verification and multiple layers of checks through the newsroom. And by the time we put it out, we would hope that it would be correct and accurate, because we do have reputations to maintain, and the credibility and the trust of our readers is critical to us. Having said that, it's also true that we would pay a special attention to content or stories which relate to race or religion or national security, because they are of a different order of significance. So you would get a senior person, a senior editor, going through those stories and reading it extremely carefully, because we know that while we want all our stories to maintain a certain standard, some stories have more of an impact on society. So we would take a special care with those.
I'd just like to add, because we are dealing with this information almost every hour, every minute. So when some of the things come through, it's very difficult to detect whether it's going to be cause a greater impact or not. Sometimes information may look very small. But for the same thing, we take the similar approach, similar standard, especially matters relating to race and religion, to make sure that everything is accurate, and we take a step back and take a look. The checking process is rigorous to make sure that this won't go out without being verified or in the full context as it should be. So I think it's a day-to-day process, hour by hour process, and as I said just now, it's difficult to know whether a certain piece of information is going to grow bigger than what it is.
What happens when you make a mistake around this zero tolerance to falsehoods and accuracy?
It's quite clear. When we do make a mistake, there's full transparency in explaining why we made that mistake, being public that we made that mistake, and explaining what the actual truth is and where the error was. So I think that's a key thing that differentiates mainstream media in correcting mistakes that may eventually or unavoidably happen.
So the same applies to us. I mean, we take mistakes, inaccuracies, wrong information that we put out extremely seriously. We would want to check and find out what happened and why. We want to take a remedial action to find out what happened and try to avoid it happening again, because it does impact our credibility. So I think that is what distinguishes us from other players. The sense of angst that is felt in the newsroom when something like that happens is tremendous, because we know that the trust that we have earned with the public is precious and not to be taken lightly at all.
So, gentlemen, I'm going to challenge you a little bit on what you've just said in contrast to what you said in many of the comments prior to this. If you as a community of journalists in your professional behavior have a zero-tolerance approach to inaccuracy and falsehood, that you will, as far as possible, ensure the veracity and truth of what you put out, why should we not all be held to that same standard? Because in much of what you've said prior to this point, forgive me if I'm misunderstanding, you're suggesting, I think, that it's okay for us to not be so scrupulous, to not have a zero-tolerance approach to online falsehoods. But that's not the standard you hold yourselves up to. You hold yourselves up, if I understand what you've just described, to a zero-tolerance approach around falsehood, that you want to, it is your professional responsibility to make sure that what you put out is true and verified. But you have, up until this point, argued that we shouldn't have a zero-tolerance approach to falsehood when it comes to the online space and society in general. Now, that may be a reasonable position, but help me understand why there should be a different set of standards for professional journalists as opposed to everyone else.
I'm not so sure we're saying what you are suggesting we are saying. What our view, I think, is that you should distinguish between the deliberate spread of falsehoods and someone who spreads information quite innocently without any intention to mislead. And our fear is that if you don't make that distinction, you will cause the flow of information to seize up. And people who may have a genuine difference of interpretation about data or information or a different point of view will be cowed or fearful about offering that information. And that would make our jobs much, much more difficult. Our ability to keep our readers and our citizens informed a lot more difficult. And that's why we're saying, please have a care. We're not saying that you should be cavalier about the kind of information that's spread. We're just saying that there is a potential downside if the legislation that you come up with is too broad and too sweeping. And that's why we've put it in that context.
Yes, I think I'd agree with Warren. It's really a question of not just falsehoods. We're talking about DOFs, where it has to meet the criteria that we've spelled out in our submission of it being deliberate, the intent being there. The target of this DOF is not coffee and cancer, I think I heard you guys talking about earlier. It is really targeting a fundamental part of what is Singapore's DNA. And if it meets those criteria, I think you're well within your powers to go at 100%. But there are going to be many other DOFs which don't meet that criteria, and that is where the graduation, I think, that we're talking about comes into play.
If I could perhaps try and explain it this way and see if you agree with me, you're not suggesting that it's a good thing to have low-level deliberate online falsehoods that don't meet the test, but you just want to make sure that whatever tools and means we use to address falsehoods in general don't have any negative consequences on the ability to have an informed public debate around issues and for you to do your job as journalists.
Yes.
Yes, I would agree, and I would say that's not only a concern of us as journalists, I would say it's a concern of many people in the public as well.
I agree. Thank you. Last point, we have not spoken much about this, but do you have views about advertising? Your platforms, and we've spoken a lot about journalism and how journalists do their work and what the role they play in society, but your platforms, your products carry advertising, and you talked about the advertising revenue, but is there an issue with being accountable for paid advertising that may address some of the issues about deliberate falsehoods here with respect to perhaps what is happening in the online space?
I would say so because it goes to the issue of trust and credibility as well. We take advertising, but we don't allow advertisers to influence our news judgment. And we certainly, if we do run sponsored content, but we clearly mark those as sponsored so that we are upfront and honest with our readers. That's not always the case with some online players, where content is maybe sponsored and not clearly marked and labeled. And I think that is dishonest and they should be called out.
We have the same practices when it comes to content that's sponsored or which has an advertiser influence on it. It is clearly marked out. And that, I think, is useful for the audience to know the origin of this content and who has had a hand in crafting this piece of content.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.